everybody. Hi, Shirley. Our guest today is Dr. Noel Buttigieg, historian and daughter of bread and bakers in 18th century Malta. Sorry, on screen. Doctor, thank you for accepting this interview and glad you could make it. Can you hear me, Doctor?
Sure.
There you are. Okay. So first things off, everyone, great book, you should get it. I'll be dropping a link later, but I had some questions about this book mainly, starting with the bread itself. It seems that the idea of bread in Malta was like something that we're very lucky to have because we can't produce enough grain, we don't even have enough firewood, we have water problems. So how did it come to be that such a fragile food supply becomes one of the main sources of food in the area?
So here we're talking about a community, an 18th century community of approximately 100,000 people, whom for at least 3 to 4 centuries have known that the island could not supply enough grain to sustain the population. When the Knights of St. John reached Malta in 1936, we know for a fact that the population was 1/5 of that before they actually left. And yet, in spite of the small size, there were already situations where Malta depended squarely on importing grain, large quantities of grain from Sicily. Of course, keeping in mind that Malta, as part of the Habsburg Empire, also fell directly under the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and thus also could enjoy some rights, such as the tratte, in other words, the possibility of extracting grain from Sicily without paying taxes on the product itself, meaning that the product, upon reaching Malta, considering also extra expenses required to transfer the product from Sicily to Malta, could actually keep the price of grain relatively low. This being said, therefore, I say in part of the book, I describe the island as a God-forsaken island, as you have rightly so pointed out. We're talking about an island where it's not just a question of not producing enough food, but of having so many other challenges, including the problem of double insularity. So with the coming of the Knights, if anything, with the coming of the Knights, we start to experience this transformation of looking at the sea as that physical isolating factor and transforming it into a bridge, into a force of connectivity with large parts of the Mediterranean, especially the southern end of Mediterranean Europe. That being said, it was made possible for the islanders to sustain themselves. And so here we're talking about one of the most basic. Piero Camporesi, Roy Porter, in the introduction to Piero Camporesi's Bread of Dreams, he refers to it as the stuff of life. In other words, it was the main marker of identity on so many different levels. White bread, brown bread, white bread of the rich, brown bread of the poor. If you don't have any bread, that means that you're existing below the poverty line. So there were so many elements that defined everyday existence simply by having enough bread to eat. So here we are talking about an island, this God-forsaken island, that to a certain extent was held hostage to Sicilian grain. In fact, one element that I discuss in the book is this tightrope that the grandmaster, several grandmasters, had to negotiate on a diplomatic level to ensure year in, year out that enough grain would be supplied. Here we're talking about a situation where the main granaries of Sicily would first keep grain for themselves, and then they would export grain to settlements within Sicily itself. And these settlements had to pay the tratte, unlike Malta. And then after all of this, if there's any left, then Malta, in competition with so many other cities, port cities in the Mediterranean, would compete for its share of grain to provide for the Maltese population. And so,
Okay, excuse me, just to make it clear, so places which had to pay the tratte would be preferred, obviously, because then the seller would be making a profit on that. Is that correct?
oh yes, most certainly. So the tratte were paid to Palermo, which is where the viceroy, the Habsburg viceroy, was the seat of the Habsburg viceroy was found. Palermo was also deciding on how many grain gets to be exported to Malta, how many would be exempted from tratte. So there are, what the price would be. When would the caricatore, so the ships that would transfer the grain to Malta, there was a whole system of regulation that the Maltese government had to navigate through year after year to make sure that grain would reach the island. So, in Maltese, we always say that Malta atma rifjutat am. The Maltese, Malta never rejected any grain, for obvious reasons, because bad harvest in Sicily immediately meant that hunger would be experienced in Malta. So,
And at the same time,
what's
it's not
also
just,
very
excuse me,
sure, go ahead.
at the same
Sure,
time, it's
sure.
just not just a question of keeping the population fed, because as soon as it looks okay, the granaries are almost empty, people are going to start rioting.
Well, I mean, we've never heard of any revolutions happening because of a shortage of wine or a shortage of meat. All the revolutions that we know of would actually have people going into the street simply because there is a shortage of grain, there is no bread, the quality of the bread is poor. So the lack of grain immediately meant social unrest. So the government, to this very day, has the solemn obligation, well, maybe today less than the period that we're talking about, because here we're talking about an 18th century population where almost 70% of its diet depends on grain, some form of another of grain, whether it's pasta or biscuit, but primarily bread. And then it's some other products. Of course, today our diet has changed to the point that the consumption of bread had decreased significantly per capita when compared with an 18th century diet. However, that being said, just to put ourselves into context, one couldn't afford to have an entire population experiencing the problem of not having enough grain. In fact, even the Grand Master had put into place all the necessary offices to make sure that that a good measure of grain coming in and into the granaries and grain going out of the granaries was constantly kept at check. And because, among other things, the Grandmaster wanted to play offensive when it came to grain supplies. So, we have situations, especially in the 18th century, when people are extremely concerned that the government is not doing his bit in all of this, which of course was not the case. the Knights of St. John had, invested a lot of energy and especially money, for over a century. The price of bread had hardly changed, meaning that each time that there was an increase in price, and there were several price spikes in the 18th century, these were always absorbed by the treasury of the Order of St. John. So the government would pay the extra money to avoid having an increase in the price of bread locally. So what appears to be a straightforward and rather easy negotiable experience, in reality, it was a very demanding, a very challenging, year in, year out exercise in trying to ensure that every single grain that enters the Grand Harbor would eventually be transformed into some form of raw or cooked or baked grain. It was as simple as that, and that is why in the book, well, I think it would be an exaggeration if I would say there is a lot written about grain provisioning. In other words, the diplomatic arrangements, the negotiations on a political level that used to happen between Malta and Sicily. There are a couple of historians that have dabbled into this, and without any doubt, they have provided us with a very clear picture of such negotiations. We also have some researchers that have also worked on bread after that it is baked, and in other words, bread that reaches the table, bread that is about to be consumed. What I found was that there seems to be a gap between what happened to the bread, or better, so what happened to a grain from the point that it enters, an ear of corn, from the point that it enters into the harbor until it eventually gets to be transformed into a loaf of bread. I was intrigued by that phase in the life of a grain. In other words, the transformation of grain to flour and eventually into bread, which in the book I refer to as the grain bread cycle, meaning the grain comes in, the grain gets to be transformed into bread, the bread gets to be eaten, meaning that you have to go back to the grain and start the process all over again. And this could happen on all levels. The grain bread cycle could be employed on a macro approach, looking at the government itself, but also on a micro approach, thinking about a family. A family that would buy an amount of grain in the beginning of the week, would transform it into bread, would eat that bread, and then the following week would have to go out and again buy grain. So this grain bread cycle, this ongoing process, is eventually loaded with so many beautiful intrigues that one could find, I would say, indirectly in some of the rich archives that we find on the island.
I think one of the things that surprised me most and that I was really not expecting is how much of this cycle was involved with, was infiltrated by black marketeers, racketeers, kind of, at some point you mentioned basically an entire flour and grain underground trade.
Let me say something about the archives before we go into that, because that is, now you just opened up I would say one of the most interesting aspects that emerged from this research. For those who are following this and thinking that what you have to do is just go to the archives and look for letter B for bread, and there you go, you can then start doing your research. That is not the case, especially in the case of Malta. That is not the case. In my case, at least, most of the references come from the archives which are related to criminal courts of justice, proceedings of the criminal courts of justice, proceedings of the criminal courts of the Inquisition. So technically speaking, any references to bakers, bread, grain, flour, merchantmen, ship captains, ship laders, loaders, carriers, all of these individuals who somehow or some way would have some sort of link, some sort of connection with um, grain or flour or bread. We would learn about these often indirectly, meaning that in many cases, what happens is that there is a situation which is an infringement of law, and then bread or grain or flour or milling or or anything related to bread itself would be mentioned. So this brings forth aspects, maybe dark aspects of this bread world, an underground bread world, where if you wanted to make business, especially at times when grain was running short on the island, the best way of how to make business was actually by selling grain. Grain could bring a good price on the market, and at the same time, because they were dealing with such a product which was on such high demand, we start to see also the formation of these very intricate networks of people who would help each other to ensure to smuggle grain into Malta, or smuggle grain out of granaries, or smuggle grain or bread from bakeries. So there is this intricate underground arrangement, which of course gave the police a headache from time to time, because breaking such circles was not entirely easy, and more than anything else, it's pretty much like the drug world today. You actually arrest one person, and there are already 10 more ready to take the place of that individual, and we have that situation in the 18th century. It's very clear of this arranged manner of how.
I think you mentioned like one or two, let's call them bread families, but
Oh, yeah, I think you're referring to the Cups family, for
yes,
instance.
yes.
Yeah. So what Karl is referring to here are actually, two of the leading, to a certain extent, I could refer to them as cartels.
Pretty much, yeah.
So one family had, I mean, one family was really well connected, in the sense that you had one of the brothers was a baker. One of the brothers, another brother within the same family, was a high-ranking official within the police force. You had one of the brothers whom, like very much like an octopus, had a tentacle in every single business that one can think of. Not necessarily illicit business that one can think of on the island, but also, they had carters, they had ship captains, they had ship loaders, they had, they had this very sophisticated network of individuals by which they could, among other things, smuggle grain as soon as this reaches the island. And as many of us might assume that, because it's actually quite hilarious sometimes. Sometimes grain was literally smuggled, like a ship laden with grain would be smuggled under the cover of darkness in the Grand Harbor itself, which is a hub of activity for Malta.
I think you mentioned also in the book that all business had to legally cease at sunset, right?
Well, yes, I mean, any maritime activity reaching the island and at sunset was not allowed to sail deep into the harbor. In fact, those ships were allowed to sail into the harbor, but they all had to berth um, just close to a spot in Malta, which we refer to as the old fisheries, the old fish market. So all ships had to berth there. No ships had, no ships were allowed to actually sail into the harbor under the cover of darkness. Not only that, but as part of this process in trying to regulate not just grain, but anything that was being imported into the island, a ship captain had to provide 3 copies of the cargo laden on the ship itself. 1 copy would be kept for himself. 1 copy would be given to the harbor middleman, and 1 copy gets to be filed. Unfortunately, none of this documentation as yet has been found. We only get to know situations of products or cargo being laden on ships as a result, primarily in either in insurance claims found in another very important archive that deals with court cases related to maritime activity, or else you have situations where people that invested in the importation of products were either defrauded or they were cheated, and so you have these situations which would be solved eventually in a specialized court dealing specifically with maritime activity. So technically speaking, we do not have records that indicate the amount of grain that was laden on each and every ship, who was the ship captain, the provenance of the grain. We don't get to know, or at least we don't have a complete archive to actually draw a scientific, quantitative picture of this activity. However, we would still learn from the archives that I have consulted, information of ship captains, for instance, Sicilian ship captains that are striking arrangements with Maltese grain smugglers. In other words, try to imagine this, all the preparation that happens before this arrives to Malta. I mean, the arrangements, the networks, the talks. I mean, today we talk a lot about talks and and agreements, and think a little bit about what appears to be a very simple society, and yet able to be so complex and so complete in making possible for an entire ship under the cover of darkness to be pulled with ropes all the way to an area referred to as Mena in the innermost part of the Grand Harbor in Malta that forms part of a town called Marsa. So try to imagine a number of men who are actually pulling this vessel under the cover of darkness into the innermost part of the Grand Harbor, and then you have 2 priests from the town of Ormi, which is known for its quantity of bakeries found in it, and 13 carters, whom with their mules and donkeys and their carts and their sacks are meeting all in one part of Marsa and together congregating, so that eventually at night they would unload the ship and eventually, of course, dispose of the product, sell the product, the stolen product at a high price to anyone who was interested. Of course, Karl, you referred to the black market, so there was this element of a black market. And if you're needing grain, you don't give away the names of the people that you can buy food from.
Of course,
So
if you're depending on them, yeah.
exactly. So this was a very closely knit community of patron-client relations, and you don't give names to the police because somehow or some way, someone's going to look you up, someone's going to beat you up. And we find these situations of people who are bribed, police that are bribed with the wardens at night, the night wardens who are striding up and up up and down the quay, just outside of Pinto Wharfs, to make sure that no one is breaking into these wharfs to steal grain.
No, I mean, thinking about it, even you mentioned Marsa, for example. Even at that time, I don't think it was like a wasteland. I think it was quite populated at the time. No.
Oh, no, this is, there was a lot of activity in the area. Definitely not as big as we know it today, but here we're talking about the space which, among other things, was still also very productive agriculturally. In fact, the Knights of St. John had areas from Marsa all the way down to Army and Luau, which the order used for agricultural purposes. And among other things, within the same, in fact, in Army, there is still an area known as Lala, the field. And I believe it is also referred to in the novel published by Juan Mamo in the 1930s, called Ulitin na Venut Flamerki, which talks about a couple of army people who, among others, a number of army people that would travel to the United States in the hope of finding a future there. They were also coming from the area known as Lala. So here we're talking about, even though not necessarily populated, it was an area that was very productive. And so, in the early in the morning till late in the evening, these were spaces that were very active. Of course, that changes during the night. Here also, we're talking about a society where you don't have electricity, and so it was relatively easy, under the cover of darkness, that one would negotiate roads leading to the Grand Harbor, and eventually conduct illegal activity to achieve, in the case of the Grand Master, the wrong ends. And of course, this was one thing that aggravated the Grand Master big time. And some of the fines and some of the time spent in prison. Well, of course, here we're talking about a period where imprisonment was not a punishment. Imprisonment was just a period during which one would wait until all the evidence is collated, and then eventually a punishment is
Just to make sure you
is
don't run away beforehand, right?
exactly. So the concept of imprisonment is very different from our concept of imprisonment. It's not a question of re-education in the case of the 18th century. So here we have, like the Cups family that you are alluding to. Each time that a significant amount of grain was stolen, was negotiated, was smuggled, the first family to actually be one of the big families that would have members arrested straight away would be the Cups family. Um, the other family, known as Tachanaklu, again, this is another complex. This is a very intricate network of arrangements of people who um, were not scared of smuggling grain. It was good business. It was a good way of how to make money. And so, for a baker, it was a good opportunity to actually buy grain at a cheaper price. And the same thing as in the case of a miller. There is all of this happening in a very tight space. We have to keep in mind that when we're talking about the Grand Harbor in the 18th century, we're talking about almost one-third of Malta's population existing in a rather claustrophobic space. I mean, everyone is rubbing shoulders. Rich people, old people, young people, poor people, they're all rubbing shoulders with each other. And so, news traveled very quickly, and one's business became everyone's business in no time at all. The question is, are you willing, especially when you're dealing with, such form of organized crime, are you willing to tell on such people, especially when people knew who this Kaps family was, who this Tachanaklu family was. And we know of situations of orders being given for people to be beaten up, including members of the police force who captured, caught red-handed people making arrangements to steal grain, also working for the Kaps family and the Tachanaklu family, and eventually them getting the wrong end of the stick, um, simply because they were doing their job. So there were so many opportunities for people to steal. If I were to put you into context, and this is what makes it really interesting. I mean, the grain reaches the island loose in the hull of the ship. The first people that get in touch with the grain are the loaders. These are the people that would actually fill the grain in sacks, and then eventually those, each and every sack is put on a boat, and that boat is then taken to the quay, and from the quay you would get a clerk, what was known as misuratore di frumento, and basically the sacks were mainly of three sizes.
Mhm.
So by looking at the sack, one could actually record the weight the approximate weight, at least the approximate weight of grain carried in each and every sack. Once that a ship load was transferred to the quay, then the clerk at the quay could actually look at the paperwork and equate whether all the grain that was registered on the ship was actually all transferred onto the quay. From the quay, the grain was either stored in sacks within the Pinto wharfs, at least in the 18th century, of course, because Pinto wharfs were built in the 18th century, or otherwise, and preferably, the grain was transferred either to Valletta, and here I'm referring primarily, so for those people who think about the granaries in Floriana, the granaries in Floriana were built in the mid-19th century. So, and what is left today is only a fraction of what we had until very recently. But the granaries in Valletta were found mainly, and some of them still exist today. They were found mainly in front of Castile, and also in front, and they still exist to this very day. And in front of Saint Elmo, on the other end of Valletta.
Okay, just
Then,
for
of course, we're
I'm sorry, doctor. Just for people who are not familiar with them, we're talking about I think pretty massive silos. I think I forgot how deep they are, but they are pretty deep. Cut into rock,
oh yes,
waterproofed, and then they have a big stone slab covered on top of that. So once the grain is in there, you're not just going to go and nick a couple of grains.
oh yes. So of course the grain is being transferred to these silos, to these grain silos. But you also had grain silos in Senglea, and also grain silos in Vittoriosa. None of these silos still exist to this date. So of course there was also therefore a lot of activity from time to time of grain being transferred from Pinto wharves into the silo. So because ideally grain is stored loose. For those who are familiar with the Castile area, there is also a space known as Dar la Nona, and the Nona was simply the distribution center in Malta. It was also the clerical space where all the records were kept of how much grain was stored and how much grain was being distributed for different reasons in different parts of the island. So this is part of the process. Now, so what you also had therefore is that unless you have sacks that are being stored in these wharfs down by the quay in the Grand Harbor, then any grain that was transferred into into the granaries. Uh, then you have a lot of carters with their mule-driven carts that would take the sacks from the quay into Valletta, and each carter was given a number. That number, the clerk at the quay would record the number and the amount of sacks that are being transferred by a single carter, and then that number needs to be balanced out with another clerk at the granaries that would record next to that number would record the amount of grain being delivered. The reason why is because there was a lot of cheating, and we've had in the records we find people that say that they lost the numbers. Some would say that they were having a drink of water and someone stole the sack from the from the from the load. So there are so many instances of
Do we ever
carters.
do we ever have situations where because that sounds to be like a scenario where literally, okay, I've got my top quality grain just imported from Sicily. I've got a couple of sacks of lower quality grain. I'm just going to switch these out and go on my way.
Oh, most certainly. I mean, wet grain. We have people that would actually dive and collect wet grain, or else you would have a ship that on its way to Malta would take in water. Uh, that grain is deadly. The first thing you need to do is you need to wash it really well, and then you need to allow it to dry. And in fact, in the book itself, I also refer to an instance where such grain used to be spread on top of Pinto wharfs, on the roofs of Pinto wharfs. And we have, 2, 3 individuals who would climb down the faces of the bastions onto the roofs, which of course are adjoining the bastions themselves, and they would steal grain. They would hoist grain up under the cover of darkness. We have
Ah,
some references also to these kind of adventurers, these rock climbers
yeah, and
who
that's a hell of
would
a
who
climb
would
over there.
Oh yes, it is. But in the book, I only provide reference to two very complicated, because there was a whole investigation happening, and eventually, for instance, one rope was found in a in a well. It was ditched in a well so that the police won't find it, but they managed to find it. Of course, this is not CSI Miami, so this is not DNA sampling. We don't have UV light. We don't have fingerprinting, so we don't have this. But of course, there was, for that time, there was a rather rigorous process of trying to understand the nature of the infringement. And in many cases, you're depending on people who would come forward and say, yes, this is what's happening, and yes, I've witnessed this situation. But you also have people who have either been given a hard time by these same individuals, and who would seek this as an opportunity to, as a payback of reporting them to the police. So the police was very cautious. They were not as gullible as we might think. So they were very cautious before they jumped to conclusions in trying to understand the nature of the infringement. But in this case, these two gentlemen from Floriana, um, who regularly made attempts in breaking into the wharfs. Can you imagine going into the trouble of uh, and of course this is a difficult time of actually cutting down a bar from a window, shortening the bar so that um, what you do is you just lift it enough to create a gap, to loosen it from its place, to go into a wharf, uh, fill a sack of grain, get out of the same window, and then you slide back the bar, the shortened bar, just holding
Just
into
so that
its,
no one will understand where you came
so
from, so you
just
have
so
a
that the
convenient
police would not,
backdoor. Yeah.
exactly, so that the police won't won't suspect that people are still, but of course, when you're stealing a sack of grain out of, I don't know how many kilos, how many tons of grain in each wharf and in each granary, we're talking about, you know, very little. But once that you put them together, so in 1748, I believe I there's I think I did not include it in the book itself. The in just 3 months of 1748, the courts of justice had in its possession around 500 kilos of grain that was picked up from situations of people who are negotiating, trafficking grain within the environs of Valletta. So, yeah, there was a good business in stealing such products.
No, I mean, when you think about it at length, it kind of feels like it sounds like we're talking about a drug trade almost, because I think some of this, some of the same things going on. But
Yes, and yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was going to ask, so how is there some way to approximate the value of, I don't know, one sack of grain in today's terms to help people understand what value we're talking about?
Value with regards to money.
Well, let's say monetary value.
So, well, it's not going to sound as if it's much, but we're talking about somewhere in the region of 80,000 euros per annum spent on grain. For the 18th century, that is a massive sum. But there again, it was a necessity, and in some cases, the amount of money spent was also related to the situation, as I've already said earlier, around the situation in Sicily. Let me also clarify a couple of things, because earlier on you also made reference to, you know, good grain of very good quality. We also know of situations where so the grandmaster also used to appoint an ambassador whose job was to just negotiate grain. Can you imagine that? Ambasciatore di grani. That's how it's referred to in the documentation. His job was specifically to get as much grain as possible, as at the cheapest price possible. And in some cases, especially in times of good harvest, the Sicilians would have wanted to get rid of any old grain from their granaries so that they could replace it with good grain. And yes, sometimes the Maltese were consuming grain, second-class grain that the Sicilians didn't want, simply because they preferred, and clearly because we know that fresher grain would produce a better quality bread. So yeah, there were situations, regular situations, when the Maltese were consuming grains that were of an inferior quality, of second class quality. So it is so in that case, of course, the sum that I just quoted would be slightly inaccurate, because we also know of situations where the grandmaster would strike through the ambasciatore dei grani, Giapaolo De Piro was one of them. I mean, he was a fantastic gentleman, fantastic negotiator. He had fantastic years where he saved money for the order, but he also had difficult years, where he just didn't even know from he would travel, you know, north to south, west to east of Sicily, trying to find as much grain as possible to feed Malta. You know, so technically speaking, Maltese mouths depended squarely on the ability of the ambasciatore dei grani.
That's a
So
lot
as
of
much as we talk
responsibility. Yeah.
about the Grand Master, I'm sorry.
So that's a lot of responsibility.
Oh yes, and of course, among other things, he used to be sent with a lot of money, and he used to be accompanied with one and sometimes two galleys of the Knights of St. John, just to make sure that that the necessary protection is given, because you have a lot of corsairing activity also happening um, in the channel between Malta and Sicily. So you in the first place you don't want to lose the money, because losing the money meant that you would lose the grain. But at the same point, the money was important to strike the best deal possible. So exactly, it was an office with a lot of responsibility, and yet it was also an office that was considered as of particular importance by the Grand Master and the treasury itself.
But I think you also mentioned that, for example, locally grown grain was considered to be of a second quality also, of a second grade also. But if it
Well,
was mixed with higher quality grain, would someone actually be able to tell the difference, or is it something that it would take a specialist to know?
so we talked a lot. We talked a lot about the grain reaching the island and the grain being negotiated before this gets into the next phase, where one could again find a lot of cheating. The first port of call, of course, would be the miller. Um, so grain needs to be milled. Wet grain was really lousy to be milled. In fact, millers wouldn't want to mill grain that was wet, simply because we're talking about a process where you have two hard rock um, wheels that actually are laying on top of each other. And what happens is that the grain enters in between the narrow space between the two rocks and the one rotating rock. So you have one fixed rock and one rotating wheel, and the rotating wheel is actually what causes the crushing of the seed. There is in the documents we find what is known as prima scorza and seconda scorza. In other words, the first level of crushing produces what resembles close to what we today call wholemeal flour. And then you have the seconda scorza, which what happened was that the wheels would be brought closer to each other, and so the seed, so all the chaff and the flour would be crushed further into a finer material. Um, Therefore, of course, producing a better product. But this is also a society where, besides grain, in other words, wheat, you also have a lot of barley that is also being crushed, which of course generates a darker color to the bread, to what we today refer to as wholemeal bread, brown bread. Back in the 18th century, it was considered to be cheap bread. It was the bread of the poor. It was believed that it was very difficult for the stomach. It was very hard on the stomach to process, to digest. It wasn't considered to be fine. Of course, refined flour produced white bread, and everyone dreamt to eat white bread, also because it was sweeter in taste, and it did not have all those uh, pieces in it that would end up in between one's teeth that also need to be crushed. So that sensation also we have people that comment about the sensation of having to actually crush, in some cases also parts of the seed itself. And sometimes I give the example of popcorn. It's like when you get to the bottom of a bag of popcorn, you start picking on the seeds also, and you start crushing also on the seeds. And try to imagine also having that situation, especially if you don't want to pay good money to refine your product. But here we're talking about a society where once that you buy the grain, so you would buy the grain, you would take it to a miller, you would pick it up from the miller, you would then knead the flour into bread, into a dough at home, and then you would take the dough to a baker. The job of the baker was exclusively to bake your bread. That's it, full stop. So the majority consumed homemade bread. So, you know, the 2 points of worry would be the miller, who might steal some of your product, who might mix some of your flour with cheaper flour for him to make better money, more money. So there was that element of cheating there. And in the book, I refer to 1 or 2 situations of people doubting the services of millers. But then the next point of contact would be the baker. So, you know, you take your dough, your shaped dough, into 2 or 3 loaves. And what the baker does is the baker would take a small part of your dough, would shape it back into the loaf, and would bake it for you. Now, if the baker is baking 10, 20 loaves, homemade loaves, then a piece from each piece of dough means that he could produce 5, 6, 10 more pieces of bread, 10 more loaves. And so that would be all profit for the baker. So the element of cheating in that regard was also very high. So, you know, clients would, so bakers of good trust, millers of good trust, would really bank on their honor, because if their honor goes down the drain, then their business would literally go down the drain. And we have situations of bakers who, because of infringements, would have their family ruined, would have their business ruined, would have themselves ruined. And so, you know, the baker and the miller were always situated between a hard edge and a rock.
I mean,
Especially
uh,
when, yeah, you go ahead, Karl.
I'm sorry. The impression I got from your book is that, for example, a baker's license was extremely draconian. It's like it's very strict. It's got some very specific conditions, and you really have to stick by the rules. Otherwise, basically, you'd never be working again.
Exactly. So, so what happens is, you know, one interesting development that starts to happen it was happening in Vittoriosa, but eventually primarily in Valletta, since the coming of the Knights of St. John in the 1530s. In other words, there is this growing interest of generated by the Knights of St. John of consuming ready-made bread. In fact, upon their arrival, the Knights of St. John would literally appropriate a number of bakeries in Ormy, who were given the responsibility of producing bread, large quantities of bread for the Knights of St. John, primarily since the Knights of St. John had several institutions that they sponsored. So bread went for the Navy, bread and ship biscuit went for the Navy, bread went for the hospital, bread was given to the auberges. So the Knights, coming from Rhodes, the Knights already had that mindset of providing bread to all of their institutions. So upon their arrival in Malta, there wasn't such a bakery that could produce large quantities of bread. However, just before the siege, and we already have reference to it before the siege, there was a bakery. We don't know how big the bakery was, but the Knights of St. John were already in control of a bakery in Vittoriosa, in where we today have the open square, Victory Square in Vittoriosa. And we know of this. We have 2 or 3 references to it. One of them is a reference to the Kollakio, the idea of having this secluded monastic space where only the knights would operate in, and it says, it gives reference that the Kollakia was going to reach the corner closest to the bakery of the knights. But then we also have a reference of the number of slaves and bakers working within the bakery itself. So this is a clearly it's a, well, industrial. We cannot really use the word industrial for the period that we're referring to, but just for the sake of who's following this, just to understand that here we have a baker that is producing large quantities of bread, way more than any other bakery that one could find in 18th century Malta. However, we still have, in the 1590s, we have an inquisitor who, upon his arrival in Malta, would have to deal straight away with the number of disgruntled bakers, army bakers, whom were paying, who are working very hard, but they were being underpaid for their services. And so the inquisitor would actually negotiate between the grandmaster and the bakers a better way of how to sustain the supply of bread in Malta. However, uh, once Valletta was being planned, so after the Great Siege of 1565, the knights would become, more convinced to actually settle it in Malta, and so plans would start to build the new city of Valletta. And one of the first locations identified in Valletta um, was actually a bakery, the bakery that still existed until 1931, before it being demolished. And so the Knights of St. John did not want to repeat the same mistake of having this new settlement without an actually full-fledged bakery. So what I'm trying to get to is the fact that you have so many now Maltese people who are working for the Knights of St. John, who are also being paid in bread, in ready-made bread. And that's ready-made bread. These men were actually taking this bread back home, and now wives at home did not really have to prepare bread, um, meaning that there is this shift, especially in the harbor area, there is this shift among many inhabitants of Valletta, Vittoriosa, Cospicua, Sanglia, and eventually Floriana, of actually consuming ready-made bread. And so we start to see this very interesting development in, halfway through the 18th century of bakers who originally used to just offer the service of baking homemade bread,
Mhm.
and actually transforming their bakery into a mill, and but also into equipping the bakery itself with the necessary tools to also knead bread. So here we have, the three elements that make a professional bakery. The milling of grain into flour, the kneading of flour into a dough, and eventually the shaping of the dough and the baking of that same shaped dough into bread before this reaches the consumer. And here we start coming across the licenses, and a baker, especially what I refer to now as the professional baker, the baker that sees through the entire process of bread making, who has, you use the word draconian to a certain extent. It's very challenging. Um, so to start with, you needed someone to prove that you are a capable baker, that you can actually bake good bread. So that's point number one. So you needed someone to act on your behalf, to say that you are a good baker, a good professional baker. The second thing is that you also needed to have someone that comes in as a form of assurance that in the case that you're sick or unwell, or you have an errand that you need to run, that you would still provide bread for the day. So every single day you are expected to provide bread for the urban people. And so it wasn't, it was, again, it was a very demanding exercise. Apart from that, the baker also was responsible to have the product go through quality control. So, as part of consumer protection, again, here we're talking about a society, they don't have scales at home. If a professional baker is cheating on, with the weight of bread, and this is always, this is the French
It's a
adage
very common complaint,
phrase,
yeah.
yes, put a breaker, put a baker on this. When a baker dies, put the baker on a scale. Of course, making fun of the fact that normally bakers cheat on bread weight. So we have in the 18th century also another office of the what was known as the bollatore del pane. So this is normally it's a person of trust, normally a baker of trust, whom either a notary or the parish priest or a high-ranking official from the government would appoint this individual, that normally a baker, whose job was to actually check and oversee the quality, the weight of and the baking of professionally made bread before this reaches uh, the shelves of shops or else the stalls of the open market in Valletta. And basically what happened was that each and every baker had to uh, take all the baked bread of the day to this particular baker. The baker would see that it's of a good quality, would weigh a sample, would see that it's well baked, and then uh, the same baker would use an iron rod to stamp, of course, um, uh, to mark the bread normally on the side to indicate that the bread has passed quality assurance, a quality assurance inspection. Bakers caught selling bread that was not stamped would have their product confiscated, and normally that product was then distributed to either orphanages or the women's hospital or the hospital itself. So it was like some sort of a social service to a certain extent. But of course, it meant a disaster to a baker or to anyone who is selling bread, that his or her bread gets to be confiscated. And but of course, again, here we see bakers that are cheating. You have bakers who pay money to actually go to a bakery, and they themselves would just liberally stamp their own bread. Um,
Okay.
yeah. You have bakers that actually decide not to go through the process and still sell the bread in the hope that they won't be caught. So yeah, you have an array of people. You have bakers that would pay money um, to the bollatore del pane, simply just not to waste time uh, waiting in line to get the bread stamped. And basically, if the police were to go to the bollatore del pane and say, did Noel stamp the bread, the bollatore del pane, for a small sum of money, would say, oh, of course he did. So you have these kind of arrangements also among bakers, and of course this element of cheating becomes increasingly worrying within a society that starts to consume ready-made bread. So we have also this very interesting cultural shift where the baker would slowly but surely also start to operate at night. Um, again, here we see the origins. We often assume that bakers work at night, but in the 18th century, that is when, for the first time, so until bread was made at home, what happened was that during the day, during specific times during the day, you would take your shaped dough to the baker so that the baker would bake it for you. So the baker lived a normal life, pretty much like every other citizen in the city. In other words, he would open up the shop at, I don't know, 6 in the morning, and would close the shop at 5 in the afternoon, and then would go home, have a drink with his friends, and then go to sleep. Um, with professional baking, the baker would start to operate at night. And so in the final chapter, I also try to shed some light on the difficult world of the baker and his family, because I think it's also important to note that in many cases, a marriage meant that uh, the male was going to become a husband to two things. Well, to in this case would become a husband to his wife, but also would become married to the bakery itself, and the entire family would become married to the bakery itself. And so you have bakers that are cheating for sure. You have bakers who are living in this world that is literally turned upside down. When everyone is asleep, the baker is working, and when the baker goes to sleep, everyone is at work. And so there is, the bakers were very often deprived of a social world, and so one could understand how some bakers often resorted to alcohol as a way of relieving their stress. Um, but also you have these situations where bakers and good bakers that really meant and believed in their work, that would actually be given a hard time from other people that were not paying them regularly. Um, we have cases of bakers being beaten up in the street. I mean, two of the cases I mentioned are women that were actually pregnant, whom on delivering bread they were beaten up by men. Not to steal their bread, but actually the bread was actually trampled upon, and thus destroyed. So you can imagine the reaction of the husband upon the return of the wife, indicating uh, that apart from the beating, they lost the earnings of the day. So, um, of course, we have to be careful not to actually uh, paint a picture that this is what was happening every single day, and that is what the Maltese society in the urban parts of Malta looked like. But the criminal records, at least the documents that we are using, tend to highlight these aspects of daily life. um,
Yeah, that was one question I wanted to ask, in fact, because given your sources, there is a certain bias. I mean, people who, nice people don't usually end up in the criminal records, except as victims.
oh, without yeah, without any doubt.
But I think you can make an estimate of, let's say that if there were 100 bakers, what percentage of them show up in the criminal record? Is it like 5%, 10%?
Well, I think the numbers are really small. So I think it would be it's a good question. I don't really have an estimate, simply because uh, see, this is not a time where accuracy was something that we normally like the accuracy we seek of today. These documents were not written with with the with the researcher in mind. Um, it's I feel very lucky that I came across the list of, and I'm not sure whether it's a complete list, but the list of shops in the harbor area for two particular years, in 1760s and 1780s, actually 1760 and 1784 to be precise. Um, and these lists show, among other things, the number of bakers that one would find in the harbor area. But you start also wondering, because of the fluidity of the exercise, when you compare them to the licenses, there are lacunas in the system. In other words, you wouldn't know why three of the names are not found in the list anymore. They could have shut shop, you know they could have went bankrupt, they could have joined forces with someone else, they could have sold their business. So it's very difficult to actually generate such estimates. But then you also have bakers that are constantly whose names are constantly coming up, and not necessarily for the wrong reasons. Even though we're dealing with criminal records here, we also come across situations of, because the baker and his world was also dominated by the world of his clients. The baker was a good place, apart from church and the church parvis. The baker was a good place where one could talk about the news of the day. People would talk about who was beaten up, who was arrested, who has just got married, who's pregnant, who's not pregnant, who's
Yeah,
who
let
who
the
who had
baker
a
be central.
baby
Yeah.
born in the family. So the baker's world was to a certain extent also the city's world. And so here you have situations where the bakers are also coming in to help. In the book, I discuss, for instance, situations of, unfortunately, because still happening to this day, of domestic abuse, of women being beaten up by their husbands, and these women who are seeking shelter within bakeries at night because the bakery is open, especially in summer. In that heat, you have bakers that are sleeping on the floor in front of the bakery, just because they couldn't bear the high temperature of the bakery itself while the bread is being baked. Um, but here you have also therefore bakers who are appearing in the court, not because of their wrongdoing, but simply because they were testifying on behalf of someone else who who've had negative experiences a couple of days before. So you also get therefore examples of very good practice. I mean, without any doubts, bakers who have, to a certain extent, almost ruined their own business simply because they constantly give other people credit, and that money never gets to be collected. Uh, so you also have a lot of people, a lot of bakers who, out of their own goodwill, are helping so many other members of the same community. So I think it would be uh, I think it would be wrong on my end to give a number, but when compared, it is so. For instance, in the application of army by the parish priest in the 1760s for army to become città pinto, uh, the parish priest in his application lists over 130 bakers.
Okay.
It's a massive exaggeration.
Yes.
According to the lists that I have, which I still believe are not complete, we're nowhere, we're nowhere close, we're nowhere close that number. So um, I think it is a massive exaggeration, as much as he exaggerated the number of people living in army at the same time. Uh, in fact, he claims that there were over 6,000 people living in army, when in actual fact, according to the Studies on Imaro, which are documents that he himself would have collated every single year.
So
Um,
same document. Sorry, different documents made by the same person, but
exactly.
okay.
These were inflated numbers to impress impress the grandmaster, to elevate this rural village
Uh,
into the state of a city, right?
people never change, do they? Ever.
Oh no, I mean, history repeats itself, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So yeah, I mean, however, that being said, what I find really interesting is that even though Ormy is known as the place where one would find the highest number of bakeries, even in the period of the Knights of St. John in Malta, during times of trouble, especially when there when the grain reserves would run low, what happened was there was the system uh, that used to be adopted. Among other things, what happened was that each baker would be given a specific licensed bakers would be selected from each and every town and city in Malta, and they would be granted enough grain to feed a significant number of, or a specific, rather than significant, a specific number of people. So to a certain extent, it's an exercise of rationing, where clients would know that there was a specific baker from where they have to go and buy their. I know that you normally used to buy your bread from a different baker, but during times of grain shortages, uh, bread eaters that consumed ready-made bread had to go to specific bakers. But of course, the other problem was that one could not buy grain from the grain shops available in Malta. So all grain was appropriated by the grandmaster, and there used to be special people that used to transfer the specific amount of grain to these designated bakers whose job was to bake ready-made bread for the entire part of Malta.
And to make it clear,
I
this is
quote,
like an emergency situation, right? Just an
yes, yes,
emergency
yes. So
situation.
1748, 1749 were very difficult years, among other years in the 18th century, like the 1760s. We have 1764, 1768, very difficult years. In other words, by difficult, I mean famine, uh, you know, literally verging on famine. So people had to consume small quantities of of bread. When one would look at the libri carcerati, which were these documents recording all the people that were being arrested, or if not arrested, they were called into the courts of justice and had to pay a fine for their infringement. We would see also an increase in people stealing fruits and vegetables from fields. So in times of crisis, people found ways or tried to find ways of how to survive. 1748, 1749 were dire straits years for Malta. Um, Try to imagine this, the grandmaster also issuing licenses for the galleys of the knights, and not just corsairs, but the galleys of the knights to intercept any ships laden with grain at sea and force them to come into the harbor, and the grandmaster would not steal. It's not like corsairs. The grandmaster would pay the money, if not more than the actual price, to purchase the product so that uh, the people could be fed bread.
Okay,
Um,
so it's not just
it's,
enemy ships. It's enemy shipping. Literally, any ship you find that has green on it, you bring it here.
any
Oh, wow.
ship,
Okay.
friend or foe, any ship, friend or foe. In fact, we have one instance where uh, a number of ships belonging to the Habsburgs were intercepted and brought to Malta. And straight away, the Doge of Palermo would block any sales of grain to ships intended to sail to Malta. Any sale of grain. And in spite in spite of several diplomatic interventions, the Doge held strong for a very long time. In fact, even the Pope had to intercede at one point in time and put pressure on the Doge to lift this ban on Malta and the Knights of St. John. So yeah, there were these
Excuse me.
situations where
Would that
sure.
be the time when the Grandmaster had to make negotiations with the French ambassador in Tripoli?
Oh yes, yeah. That was a time when yes, it's friend or foe. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
realized. I mean, that blew my mind because you've got the head of a crusading order. Okay, so my friend is not giving me grain. Okay, hello, enemy. Could I have some grain, please?
Yeah. So arrangements were made um, to even allow, for instance, to close an eye and order your corsairs not to intercept ships coming from a particular area, at least for a period of time. I mean, yeah. These kind of arrangements were necessary to operate
Yeah, I mean, it is
in
an
a.
existential crisis. Yeah.
Oh yes, in fact, the same notary from where we get a lot of information was actually dumbfounded. The document is so interesting. It says we don't have what we call an SOP today, right?
Mhm.
Um, we don't have procedures of what happens in the case of grain shortages. We don't know what to do. This was primarily a critique to the grandmaster more than anything else, with whom he couldn't see eye to eye. This particular lawyer who was very much attached to and worked for the Inquisition and the office of the Inquisitor here in Malta, was at one point in time ordered to submit, as by law to this very day, all notaries and lawyers have to submit a copy of their documents for the records. This particular notary decided not to do so, and in spite of a lot of pressure, including from the Grand Master to submit his documents, he decided never not well he decided not to actually submit his documentation. So he had a chip on his shoulder, and of course this was an opportunity to actually criticize the Grand Master. And one of the documents which we find in the National Library in Valletta, he actually points out how, well, to start with, it's a fantastic document because it tells us, not just the worries, but also the negotiations and the the systems put into place, the emergency systems put into place to try to deal with this massive shortage of grain in 1748. But he also complains that, to this day, in other words, 1748, to that date, he's dumbfounded that there aren't any systems of operations put down, any documents that indicate what needs to be done and how to proceed in the case of a shortage. So we learn, again, indirectly here. We learn from this notary who's complaining about the Grand Master on how such situations were dealt with in times of hunger. So again, I always say, this research, I've been at it for almost 15 years now. So it is literally made up of fragments of information
Breadcrumbs, literally.
oh yes, I mean, this is, you spend hours on end flipping through folios, often contemplating of, whether you should quit, because you're looking for words like, baker, miller, wheat, grain, ship captain, ship laden with grain. It's you're looking for these words um, in volumes and volumes of documents which talk about murder and theft and gambling and I don't know, and sodomy and bigamy, and endless of different
I'll be honest.
illegal. Yeah.
If I try to do something of this sort, I'd probably be, oh, this looks interesting. Oh, this other thing looks interesting, and I'd probably forget what I was looking for in the first place.
Oh yes, I mean, that is definitely one challenge. So while I was doing this, of course, I was, anything related to food I'm really interested in. But then you have, I don't know, the case of one knight called Mazzacanna, who among other things, this knight defrauded the Monte de Pietà, which was this lending. It was like a bank. So he generated loads of money. I would love to write a paper about it. Um, because talk about money laundering today, you have to talk about money laundering in the 18th century. He was very good in investing money and transforming it into investments to show that he was not increasing his revenues. But again, you get to, you start reading through it, and then you'd say, no, this has to wait. It's got to, there's going to be another day when to work through this. But I'm very much intrigued about the role of women in food. But as a result of that, you end up reading documents which which food is only mentioned in a secondary manner. But then you have issues related to gender and identity and violence, and so things become really, really interesting. And so from time to time you need to draw yourself back into and say, hey, this is not what I'm doing here. I just need to take a reference to this and keep digging in what I'm supposed to be doing here. So but of course, I am also very thankful to very good friends of mine who sometimes come across references and they say, hey, Noel, I came across this, so what do you think? And I'm very thankful also because this book and this research has managed to also help me build bridges I've been telling this story now for the past 10 years to different people. So, now with you, Karl, and whoever is following, right? It has been a fantastic opportunity to open up this world into something which normally, a good friend of mine who actually bought the book said to me, I thought this was going to be leisure reading, because I never thought that there would be these kind of intricacies, the same intricacies that you've mentioned, things related to violence and corruption and theft and smuggling and black marketing. And, one wouldn't think
No, absolutely.
that
I mean,
something
that
as
it did
simple
take me
as
by
bread.
surprise.
Yeah, one would think that something as simple as bread would actually have such a world, revolving around it, a world of tension, a world of distress, but also a world of pleasure and a world of fulfillment. So, the term breadwinner is it's a beautiful word. It's really loaded with meanings of power and authority and control. Um, and so something as simple as an ear of corn uh, could actually dictate so many different aspects of daily life in so many different parts of the world, especially in this case, especially the Mediterranean world.
In fact, that was one of the things that I was at the presentation you gave during the launch of the book, and I had never made the connection between how many expressions there are involving bread, which are
Well,
still
yes,
still in use.
yeah, in the Maltese language, we don't have the I actually quote them in the book. Well, I quote some of them in the book, but the person that a very good friend of mine, Professor Kamal Kassar, was actually the first one to actually draw a very interesting list of some 10, 15 of them. These are idioms where bread is given a sociocultural meaning. We don't have the word breadwinner in Maltese, but instead we have these really intelligent, sophisticated idioms, which um, which people used by way of parlance when communicating, in measuring other individuals. So they're very much about honor and shame. They're very much about um, you know generating an economy. It's about one's skills, one's ability to achieve one's success in life. So everything is measured around bread. So one of the most simple and one of the cheapest uh, foods that one can think of, and yet there is this whole world that revolves around. There's this this very complex sociocultural world, which, apart from its political and economic connotations, it actually dictates so many different aspects of daily life. And um, the one thing that I try to do in the final chapter is actually to just look at the baker's world. But of course, it would be really interesting. And the one thing I didn't do in the book itself is look at the world around bread, the social cultural world that revolves around bread, because I have other publications that I have published that have already dealt with that aspect. So I
So
I,
we're
I
speaking,
thought.
so you mean bread at the point of consumption rather than the productions. All right.
Exactly, which of course, as I've said in the beginning of this conversation, um, it is an aspect that I dealt with, the consumption of bread and bread power. I mean, I'm very much interested in bread as a marker of gender identity, for instance, of domestic power between males and females. So I was very much intrigued by all of that, which of course is the main subject of my doctoral thesis. Many people associate me with the history of bread, but my interest is primarily in the way we speak through food. So I was very much intrigued by how women used bread as a language, as a voice, as a silent voice, to negotiate domestic control, domestic power, with respect to their male counterparts. So that was my area of interest for my doctoral. The book, however, does not venture into, or else, I mean, I dabble into it a little bit, but it is not it was not the main purpose of the book itself. So again, that is another world that one could explore when trying to study bread.
No, absolutely. If you don't mind, we have a question from the end here. Did nobody have an oven at home in those times?
The ovens at home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a very good question. The answer to it is a straight-faced no. Normally, so this is another element that I left out of the book. I have conducted research based on the notarial archives. It's still awaiting processing from my end. However, there is no indication from dowry lists, and normally dowry lists or wills that were written after someone's death. In both cases, there are situations, especially in dowries or wills that had significant amount of monies in them. These would sometimes also include details about houses, and in many cases, therefore, as a result of that, you would also learn what the kitchen is made up of. You would know that there's a stove. You would know what kind of pots and pans one would have, what type of tables, how many chairs, how many shelves. You would have this kind of information. But with one exception, none of these spaces, I have never come across any of these spaces that actually had an oven in them. The only case that I had come across is a house in Vittoriosa. This house belonged to, I'm sorry, in Valletta. The house belonged to the Russian ambassador for Malta. And he did not only have an oven, but he also had an open fire space where he also had an automated spit hooked to the same space, meaning he could roast using machinery, winding up what might look like a grandfather clock mechanism.
Are we still saying
that would be
17th, 18th century?
This is 18th century we're talking
Oh,
about.
all right.
This is a
Nice.
mechanized, yeah, this is a mechanized spit. Okay. The other example that we have is I came across another example in the inventories of the kitchen for the palace of the Inquisitor in Vittoriosa. These are the two examples that we know of. Very good question. No. However, we will find ovens in houses of the rich, and normally palaces of the rich. So the auberges, for instance, would have ovens. The auberges of the knights would have ovens. The Grandmaster's palace had ovens. The Inquisitor's palace had its own ovens. The Archbishop's palace had its own oven. So here you have, apologies, here you have an in-house system of how to bake goods apart from bread. But that is not the case for the common people.
Okay, hence the common people going from baking bread at the bakers and then buying bread, just buying bread from the bakers. I see.
Exactly.
Okay, that automated cooking system seems to be really interesting, though, I think.
Oh, it's super interesting. I mean, and we have the details that we have primarily from the Inquisitor's palace are just simply jaw-dropping. You're talking about the 18th century, and here you're talking, if you want to roast a chicken, you needed to have someone who's constantly turning the
Yeah.
spit. In this case, all you had to do, whoever's working in the kitchen would have to wind the the clockwork, and the system would start to operate on its own. So yeah, very sophisticated for the period, relatively very sophisticated.
Nice. Okay, and yeah, Tian says, thank you for going in depth with that answer, Dr. Buttigieg.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so I think we're close to wrapping up here, but I do have another question for you. According to you, that is totally a subjective answer, but according to you, what is the best way to eat Maltese bread?
Very subjective. So let me focus on the ftira, because I had registered the ftira to become UNESCO World Intangible Heritage, and it's the only food that we have, apart from wine, it's the only food that the island of Malta has so far decided to register. We have no other food that has been registered on EU level, which is, a little bit shocking, but that's, it is what it is. When we did the research for the ftira, so this is not subjective, okay? This is very objective. Of course, Maltese bread and the ftira itself is normally popularly known to be prepared with olive oil, tomato or tomato paste, with mint and pickled onions and tuna, capers. So that is normally, which is normally associated with the period that we're going through right now as a season. However, through time, we also had people preparing Maltese bread, but especially ftira, using beef and eggs and sausages. But in the research, we also found people that, like kids, enjoy eating not Maltese bread, but especially warm ftira with Nutella on it, with a Nutella spread.
Okay.
So yeah. So I think Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, a very interesting book that talks about how we as humans are constantly seeking new tastes and new experiences when it comes to our olfactory interests. When we're smelling and when we're tasting food, that we constantly seek, new tastes and new ways of how to experience the familiar. And so, when we applied for ftira, I mean, people were taken aback when I said, especially people of my age or older, when they say, "What? You're using Nutella?" I mean, yeah. So, food culture is something that changes through time, and I think it would be silly on our part to assume that food culture doesn't change. This culture is alive. Food is about sharing. It's about copying. It's about adopting something. It's about adapting something to your needs. And it's full of experimentation. I mean, many of us prepare foods using recipe books, and we download stuff off the internet, but then we pick and choose, sometimes how much we add of something, and whether there's an ingredient that you don't like, or you think it's not healthy for you, so we take things out. So as much as we want to use a recipe as a GPS, because we live in a time and age where we don't want to waste our products, we don't want to waste time, we want to make sure that we try it, and when we try it, it tastes good. However, we also experiment. So yeah, if, subjectively, I think, olive oil, tuna, mint, capers, Maltese pepper cheeselets, that would really, really, be my kind of Maltese, how to prepare Maltese bread. But, different people, different opinions, different tastes, and tastes are extremely subjective.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And what about your future projects? I'm hoping that you're taking a break after writing this, because it was a very long job. But do you have any plans for any
Well,
future
there's
project?
bread and bakers in 19th century Malta and bread and bakers in 20th century Malta.
Okay, for real?
That there's a reason, Karl, behind the name.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Uh, so of course, a lot of work has been completed, and well, that's an exaggeration. I have, you know, in these years, of course, I'm constantly doing research, and of course, the closer we get to us, the more we learn about bread and bread culture. And so I have to admit, I am more advanced when it comes to bread in the 20th century. I have already published some material, especially during the war, with regards to bread and bakers during the Second World War, especially bread and the black market in the Second World War. I believe I have two papers on bread and bakers. But this is part of a project that I've been working on. But I'm also very much intrigued right now about food in institutionalized food, primarily food in prisons. So this is my hobby. I mean, this is my job, but it is also my hobby. So I really enjoy doing this. So, and I, to start with, I hope that I, I am providing contribution here in an area which is still relatively, I mean, I can say that this is the first book for Malta that deals with one food product in such detail. We don't have, we don't have books that specifically deal with the past, the history, the heritage of a single food product. Um, Simply because food is still in its infancy here in Malta. There aren't many people working on it, and I can understand why not, because
I'm sorry,
it's a labor of love.
in the sense of
It's very
food history.
well. I mean, it's the reality is that one has to spend a lot of time doing research.
Of course.
And in many cases, people seek areas which are easier to go through. I mean, if I want to write about the Inquisition, I know that there are 400 volumes of Inquisition archives, so you can never go wrong there. But if you want to write about children and children games, good luck. Uh, if you want to write about smoking, good luck. If you want to write about I don't know, theater, good luck, especially going back to the early modern period. The reason why is because you can only come across this information in fragments. So literally, um, it's actually piecing together all these pieces of this massive jigsaw puzzle. Um, and still there are parts of it that are missing, but I think for the first time we have, I'm not saying a complete, but a first attempt of trying to understand bread in a more holistic way. So that is what I tried to achieve, at least from the book, and I hope that whoever reads it would not just enjoy reading it, but would also embark on this journey that I have embarked on for a number of years, and a journey that I have enjoyed every single minute of it.
I mean, after reading it, it was like, okay, it's like opening up a totally different subject that I had no idea even existed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is the one thing that I fell in love with. The one thing that troubled me a lot during my doctoral,
No?
because as much as I was excited about some of the things, so my tutor used to say, this is very interesting, but we've already agreed this is not the path that you wanted
No.
to explore. So I had written parts of it, small parts of it, some 15 years ago, um, but never went back to it. And I've had friends of mine saying, you have to publish this. You have this is interesting work. You have to publish it. You have to publish it. And it was thanks to Joe Mitzi, who in a private conversation, he came to me and said, listen, he said, I've heard that you have a lot of work in this regard. He said, there's a gap in the market. Let's take advantage of it. And I said, listen, if you give me a deadline, I'll work on it. And so a year and a half ago, that's how the process started. And he said, how far advanced are you in writing it? And I said, I'm done. I'm almost done, but there's one chapter that I haven't written, which is the very last chapter. Um, the two most favorite chapters in the book for me are the ones about the bakery, the Orders Bakery, because it is literally made up of fragments. It's based on photographs. It's based on site plans. It's based on bits and pieces of information. It's coming from some 8 different archival funds. It's really uh, a tapestry of bits and pieces that I had managed to actually put together, not necessarily as a final piece of work. I don't consider my book to be a final piece of work. I think the book is a prologue, actually, of something bigger. There should be more work done in this respect. And then it's the last chapter that I really enjoyed writing. It was written in just 1 week, simply because I love social history, and I try to keep it simple. I try to pepper it with, because by the time you get to the end of the book, you've had enough of reading about bread, you're getting tired, and it seems like that we love learning about other people. So I had specifically written it in a manner to make it light, but also shedding a light, opening up a window on the world of the baker, because we talk a lot about the product, but we don't really talk about the people that actually make the product.
Understood. But yeah, I didn't have enough of reading about it though, because I was very happy to hear that you were working on another one.
Yes, yes. Well, Karl, you have to wait for it. Okay, so don't hold
Uh,
your breath on it.
okay,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, but it's works in progress.
Okay, in the meantime, Diane has a question about what you mentioned about institutional food. So, are you interested in sanctioned food prepared by the prison or unsanctioned food from the inmates? That sounds interesting as well.
Yes, so thank you for the question. So by institutionalized food, basically what I mean is food that is of course planned, set up. So I'm thinking about school canteens. I'm thinking about hospitals. These are all spaces where you would have, even though things have changed a lot now, but these are also places where you'd have, an institutionalized approach, institutionalized menu. So I was very much intrigued. I've actually I was invited to speak at the Oxford Food Symposium 2 years ago, and that is how I fell in love with this aspect. But again, by sheer mistake, I was doing research about this book, and I did come across, 3 months before publishing, I did come across the site plans of the building, because of complaints emanating from the prison's bakeries here in Malta. We only have one prison, the found in Corradino and Tershan. It's known as the Cordine Correctional Facility, which is built in the mid-19th century, using the Pentonville model in London, as far as shape is concerned. So, to a certain extent, the British colonial government was using Malta as a test bed on so many different levels. And while reading through the material, as Karl has pointed out, sometimes I'm not very disciplined with keeping my focus, and I get carried away and get very much excited about other pieces of information. And here I came across the rule books, uh, the 1920 rule book of the prison, which of course starts off with the menu of telling you, what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, who prepares the food, with whom to eat. So I was very much intrigued by all of that, and so I decided to spend, a couple of hours sifting through information, and the people at the archives here in Malta and in Rabat are extremely helpful people. Um, sometimes if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be doing all of this. And two of the guys were constantly coming to me saying, "Hey, do you know what? Do you know what? There are these archives which no one has actually looked at. They're not archived. We don't have an index of them. Do you want to have a look at them?" So, they bring me trolleys full of volumes, and I flip through them, and the more I look into them, the more I was getting excited. So, what I noticed was that also reading works from social theorists. The 1920s and the 1930s were considered to be is considered to be a watershed period of a transition in the management of prisons, particularly in trying to bring into a more humane approach. Something that we're still struggling at to this very day. How can you be humane to someone who committed murder, who has killed, four women, ex them to death? How can you be humane to someone like that? So, the 1920s, 1930s, we see this transition of starting in England, this transformational phase in prison management, which is also adopted here in Malta. And I thought to myself, how interesting. Would food also be part of this transformation? And may God behold, reading through the material, I started to come across information that slowly but surely, of course, depending on the superintendent of the museum, I'm sorry, of the prison, depending on the superintendent, you start to see also these very interesting changes in institutionalized form of eating. But here we are talking about a period, primarily the 1920s and the 1930s, going all the way until 1939. Um, the paper uh, has just been published now. I'm still waiting for a copy of the book. It's part of the Oxford Food Symposium publications for the conference. They are issued every single year. I believe that it's available online to be purchased. And in the paper, I discuss ways of how food would start to slowly but surely become part of this institutionalized form. But also, I explore the politics of food, politics with a politics with a capital P, but also the politics with a small p, of how inmates, for instance, would negotiate with the cook or with the prison wardens to get some extra food or some different food on the day, because of course, food was monotonous and drab. Um, and so you have all of these situations of these patron-client power relations between inmates and influential prisoners and prison wardens and the prison cooks and the prison bakers to get either some extra food, because this is a time when we do not have any sense of communal convivial experiences. In other words, the prisoner was only allowed out of the cell during what was known as industry time. In other words, while you are working, during work time, you were not allowed to speak. You were not allowed to talk to anyone. Um, so you would eat on your own. So technically, they would deprive any single individual of any sense of conviviality. Literally, you don't decide on what food to eat. You don't decide on how much you eat. You don't decide with whom to eat. They take away, all the joy that goes with eating.
It sounds
We
like
start to see,
solitary confinement light kind of thing.
oh yes, I mean, this is part of the psychological punishment that the prisoner had to go through. The need to help you to reflect on all the liberties that were taken away from you because of your wrongdoing. By the late 1930s, we have what was known as the star grade. And the star grade, so inmates were given points for good behavior. The star grade entitled inmates to actually be able to eat in the company of each other. So there we see for the first, of course, in our heads we have images of movies where inmates would fight in the canteen and they would hit each other with trays, those metal trays, and they would trip people and bully people in the canteen. So we have those images in our heads of institutionalized eating. Well, in the 1930s we have the origins of what we know of today. We're talking about 100 years later, and we're still fighting the same battle. So, earlier on we talked about, we improved. I think we came a long way, but we're still, we talk about history repeating itself. Well, there you go. 100 years ago, Malta, a British colony, pretty much the periphery of the periphery, and yet it's being tested to be one of the earliest places where convivial eating was going to be introduced. Eventually, it will be introduced in England, in Great Britain, and the rest of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, in fact, Quiz Bertrain is saying that the US used to have a similar system.
Oh yes, very, very similar. I was very lucky last summer during the Oxford Food Symposium to actually meet uh, uh, two American colleagues of ours, one of which actually works within an institution. He said, "No, we're still fighting the same. We can see this in history. It was a normal thing. I mean, there's a parallel to it in the U.S. Of course, I'm using U.S. in a very general sense. We all know that different penitentiaries have different approaches to how to manage the system itself. But he said he's actually working in a penitentiary where as part of the empowerment to the prisoners, they are allowing them to actually grow their own crops, as a way of re-education, but also as a way of equipping them with the necessary skills, so that when they leave the prison, they would have the necessary skills, knowledge, and competencies to deal with the outside world. So, but he said we are. He said, "What's the situation in Malta?" I said, "The situation in Malta is still very much the same." And he said, "Well, Malta, because I've defined it as the periphery of the periphery." He said, "It's not the periphery of the periphery. We still have penitentiaries in the U.S., some penitentiaries in the U.S. that still adopt a very similar system." So, yeah, thank you for that comment.
Okay, now I think last question. And you're probably going to hate me for this, but how likely would it be to find something related to the same subject? So again, bread and bakers prior to the 18th century.
Oh, very good question. Um, I have evidence for the 16th and more evidence for the 17th. Um, originally, I was thinking of doing an early modern period publication. However, since I had focused a lot on 18th century material, I thought it would be wrong to write the book about early modern bread in Malta, and then have all the documentation or most of the documentation coming from the 18th century. I mean, I personally hate reading books that say the early modern period and then they equate an entire 300 years with 40 years, as if things were stagnant and things didn't change, right? However, in the case of Malta, the reason why I'm talking about Malta is because I'm really familiar with it. But if I were to suggest a couple of books, so my good friend Peter Scholyers, Professor Peter Scholyers from Vrije University, had just published the history of bread in the 18th century. We just exchanged books actually recently. He asked me the same question. He said, "No," he said, "we struggle with detailed information for the 15th and the 16th century in 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 uh, in Holland." And I said, "Well, we struggle also with the information. It's not as detailed. It's not as rich as the 18th century. However, there is information for the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th century without any doubt. It is not as detailed as the 18th century, but it might not necessarily be as sexy as the 18th century, if you allow me to use the term. So I was of course drawn with the fact that the bakeries, the orders bakeries, were firing all cylinders in the 18th century. There was an extension built to them in the 18th century. The some of the best cases of bread trafficking and stealing by the master baker were found in the 18th century. So I think that those were the main reasons why I was really drawn to the 18th century. Also because of the popularity of and the development of professional bakeries in the urban area, which do not exist in the 17th century. They would only come into being in the 18th century. And then, of course, all the other attached things to the baker's life, the regulations of how to impose consumer protection practices, and those become more articulate and better detailed and better informed in the 18th century. The book that I would like to draw your attention to is also, one of the most important. This is the vademecum of early modern bread studies. Is the book Bread and Bakers in Paris by the American historian Steve Lawrence Kaplan, who did a fantastic job with studying just Paris. Malta is a non-starter with the documentation that one finds for Paris. So, to a certain extent, well, I've sent my book to Professor Kaplan, who sent glowing remarks back. He said, this tiny little rock having so much information to give. He said it's so much encouraging to actually have other researchers from different parts of the world to actually also study bread. But Steve Lawrence Kaplan again focused on the 18th century. But then again, American historian, good friend of mine, Ken Albala, we were together a couple of weeks ago in Oxford. Ken made a very good job with looking at the 16th and the 17th century. Some of his best works are available online. So without any doubts, there is, even for a small place like Malta, there is good information that can, well, even if it's not a book, that can provide, a voluminous book that can provide very important information about bread and bakers in the early modern period.
That is excellent. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop a link to your book in the chat again. Just this one. Okay, I'm just going to say it again. I love this book. I'm not being sponsored, but I really do like this book. And yeah, I think I've kept you long enough, Doctor. And thank you again for this talk. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Sure. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, Karl. This is the second time, and it's always been a blast from my end, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably have you over every week if I could, but
well,
yeah, I think I need to give you a break sometimes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sure. All right.
But, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, and see you around. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.